Have you ever noticed how heartbreak seems to divide women into two paths? One emerges softer, wiser, not weaker, but more attuned to herself. She begins to walk with a quiet confidence, as though she finally belongs to herself. The other remains entangled, not because she lacks strength, but because no one taught her what to release, and more importantly, what not to repeat. So let me ask you, have you ever wondered why some women emerge from heartbreak stronger, while others remain stuck in the same emotional loop, reliving the same disappointment in different bodies? Heartbreak is not just an ending. It's a confrontation with the parts of you that were willing to settle. It reveals the scripts you've been following since childhood, scripts that taught you to please, to fix, to wait, to ache silently. But what if this rupture was never meant to ruin you? What if it's the moment life is asking, will you repeat or will you rise? Today, we will walk through 7 choices a high-value woman never repeats after heartbreak. Not because she's perfect, but because she's awake. Because she's finally aware of how easily we betray ourselves for the illusion of connection. By the end of this reflection, you'll understand how a woman reclaims her power, not by hardening, not by pretending she's unbothered, but by refusing to repeat what broke her in the first place. So, shall we begin? Let's start with the first pattern she leaves behind. 1. She never idealizes the past relationship. There's a moment, often quiet, often late at night, when the mind begins to rewrite the story. Suddenly, the arguments don't feel as loud. The absences don't feel as empty. The coldness turns into misunderstood affection. This is the seduction of memory, and it is the first trap that many women fall into after heartbreak. Idealization. Ask yourself, with brutal honesty, are you grieving the person or the fantasy of who you hoped they would become? This distinction matters deeply because idealization is not a reflection of the past. It's a projection of longing. It's a defense mechanism the mind uses to soothe discomfort, to reduce the pain of disillusionment. But in doing so, it distorts truth. Why do we do this? Why do women, even intelligent, emotionally aware women, find themselves remembering only the good, filtering out the betrayal, the silence, the misalignment? Because the pain of losing the illusion is often more disorienting than the relationship itself. To accept that someone was never fully present, never truly capable, or never truly committed to your well-being, that is a brutal clarity. And clarity is often more painful than confusion, at least in the beginning. But make no mistake, idealizing the past keeps you bonded to a version of the relationship that never fully existed. It places you in a psychological holding pattern where mourning becomes melancholia, a concept Sigmund Freud himself analyzed deeply. In his essay Mourning and Melancholia, Freud observed that when we fail to properly grieve a loss, when we deny or repress the truth of what was, we begin to turn that pain inward. The loss becomes entangled with our identity. We start to question our worth. We wonder what we could have done differently. The lost object is no longer just the partner. It becomes a mirror of our self-esteem. Freud might say, the ego, in its attempt to preserve the attachment, devours the image of the beloved and punishes itself with it. And what is the consequence of that? You begin to suffer, not only because the person is gone, but because you believe you lost something perfect, something rare, something irreplaceable. But was it? Or was it merely familiar? Let's name what's often unspoken. Many women are not grieving love. They are grieving attachment, and those are not the same. Love is mutual recognition, mutual growth, and mutual safety. Attachment, on the other hand, is often built from earlier emotional wounds. From needing someone to see you because your parents didn't, from staying because you were taught that leaving makes you selfish, from confusing control with protection. So here's the hard truth. When you idealize someone who hurt you, you're not remembering love. You're remembering a moment when your nervous system felt regulated by familiarity, even if that familiarity was toxic. A high-value woman, and I don't mean a woman who dresses well or earns a certain income, but a woman who has integrity with herself. She refuses to idealize what wounded her, not because she is bitter, but because she is brave enough to remember the whole truth. She does not cherry-pick memories to soothe her ache. She faces the entire picture. She remembers how lonely she felt even when he was next to her. She remembers the empty promises, the cancellations, the way she twisted herself to keep his interest. She remembers that loving him often meant abandoning herself. This is not cruelty. This is clarity. And clarity is the first act of self-love after heartbreak. So how can you practice this? I'll give you a task, one that requires courage, not creativity. Write a balanced account of the relationship. 2 columns. On the left, moments that brought you joy, connection, safety. On the right, moments that brought you anxiety, confusion, self-doubt. Be honest. Don't write what you wish had happened. Write what did. Describe tone of voice, frequency of care, responsiveness to your needs, whether you felt cherished or tolerated. Then ask yourself, if I read this as a story about someone else, would I believe she was loved or just managed? This act, simple on the surface, is profoundly liberating. It allows you to de-idealize without becoming cynical, to see the person in their fullness, not your fantasy, and most importantly, to see yourself as someone who deserves more than just potential. Freud, if he was seated beside you in this moment, might say, "You are not grieving him. You are grieving the part of you that believed this was enough." And that is where transformation begins. Because once you stop telling yourself the lie that it was perfect, you become available for something real, not just with others, but with yourself. So I ask you, what are you still romanticizing? And what would happen if you stopped? The woman you're becoming no longer needs to mythologize the past in order to survive the present. She is not afraid to tell the truth, even when it hurts. That's the first thing she never repeats after heartbreak. 2. She doesn't chase closure from her ex. There's a particular form of suffering that disguises itself as seeking clarity. You know it well. The late-night texts you draft but don't send. The obsessive rereading of old conversations. The imaginary dialogues you have in the shower, trying to find the perfect words that would make him see, understand, apologize. This is what we call chasing closure. And it's the second pattern a high-value woman refuses to repeat. But why is it so hard to stop? Because when something ends abruptly, especially a relationship where emotional needs were unmet or inconsistently fulfilled, the mind goes into a state of open loop, a state of psychological tension where the narrative remains incomplete. You feel like there's a line that wasn't finished, a door that was slammed before you could explain your side. And in that gap, the illusion forms. If I could just get one more conversation, I'd be at peace. But closure, real closure, rarely comes from the one who caused the wound. You're not actually seeking answers, you're seeking emotional regulation. You're trying to soothe your nervous system, not through healing, but through his explanation. As if his words could undo the damage his behavior caused. Let's be brutally honest here. If someone was capable of offering the kind of clarity and accountability you need for closure, they likely wouldn't have left you needing it in the first place. So what is this need for closure really about? It's about unresolved attachment, about the part of you that still hopes they'll see your worth, about the girl inside you who was trained to earn love by explaining herself, by being good, by making things right. This is not your fault. It's conditioning. From childhood, many women are taught that harmony is their responsibility, that if someone is upset or distant, it must be something they did. That closure, that peace, comes through fixing, understanding, or making amends. And so when the relationship ends, the same internal script is triggered. If I just explain myself better, maybe he'll come back. Maybe I'll feel better. Maybe I'll be enough. But let's call this what it is. Emotional dependence disguised as emotional maturity. Freud might look at this cycle and say, this is repetition compulsion, the unconscious drive to restage unresolved wounds, not to resolve them, but to re-experience their pain in a familiar form. When you chase closure, you're often not trying to heal, you're trying to re-enter the loop. You're hoping that if he acknowledges your pain, it will validate your worth, but that is a dangerous dependency, one that keeps your self-esteem hostage to someone else's reflection. And here's the harsh truth. Some people will never give you closure, not because you don't deserve it, but because doing so would require them to confront the harm they caused. And not everyone is emotionally evolved enough to do that. So what does the high-value woman do instead? She learns to close the door herself. She doesn't wait for a conversation that will never come, or worse, will come and leave her more confused. She doesn't orbit the memory of the relationship, looking for missing pieces. She chooses clarity over confusion, self-validation over external permission. She reclaims her narrative, not by rewriting what happened, but by refusing to let it define her. Let me offer you a practice, simple but potent. Write the letter you'll never send. Pour out everything, the confusion, the anger, the pain, the unanswered questions. Say what you need to say, not for him, but for you. And then, seal it. Burn it, bury it, ritualize the release. This symbolic act does something powerful. It transfers your energy from the other, the one who won't respond, won't care, won't answer, back to yourself. It teaches your nervous system. I can complete this loop without depending on someone who abandoned me emotionally. You see, closure isn't a conversation. It's a decision to stop giving energy to someone who's no longer present, emotionally, physically, or spiritually. A decision to believe your experience without needing him to confirm it. A decision to stop romanticizing what should have felt safe, but only ever felt uncertain. Freud once observed that the ego protects itself through defense mechanisms when faced with intolerable pain. Denial, projection, repression, all are ways we avoid emotional reality. But there's one defense mechanism he considered a sign of growth: sublimation, the act of transforming emotional pain into meaningful action. So what if, instead of texting him, you wrote a manifesto to your future self? What if, instead of asking him why he didn't love you properly, you asked yourself why you kept trying to prove you were lovable to someone who couldn't see it? This is what it means to take your story back, because the woman you're becoming, the one who walks with dignity, who no longer needs to be chosen in order to feel valuable, she doesn't chase conversations that end in silence. She creates closure through clarity. She learns to say, I don't need you to explain why you let me down, I see it now. And I won't explain myself either. I'm not auditioning for understanding anymore. So let me ask you, what part of you is still waiting to be heard by someone who doesn't listen? And what would it feel like to finally hear yourself instead? Let this be your turning point. The moment you stop knocking on closed doors, not because you've hardened, but because you finally understand. Your peace is not in his response. It's in your decision to stop asking questions that only keep you bound to the past. That's the second pattern she never repeats after heartbreak. 3. She avoids self-blame and over-responsibility. There is a quiet torment that many women carry after heartbreak, and it's not always grief over the loss itself. It's self-blame. The endless internal interrogation. Was it my fault? Did I expect too much? Maybe I was too emotional, too demanding, too much. Let me ask you something uncomfortable but necessary. Why is your first instinct to question your worth when someone fails to love you well? This is not merely personal insecurity. It's the residue of cultural conditioning. For centuries, women have been trained to take emotional responsibility for the emotional immaturity of others. In love, in marriage, in motherhood, in caretaking. So when the relationship collapses, it's not uncommon for a woman to immediately look inward, not in a healthy, reflective way, but in a punishing, distorted one. Self-blame becomes her way of trying to make sense of what went wrong, because blaming herself still offers the illusion of control. If it was my fault, then maybe I can fix it. If I change, maybe next time it will work. That illusion is safer than facing the truth, that some people will fail you no matter how perfect you try to be. But this is how emotional harm perpetuates, by teaching the wounded to carry what was never theirs to begin with. Let's break this down psychologically. When a woman experiences abandonment, betrayal, or emotional withdrawal, her nervous system enters a state of dysregulation. The mind craves explanation, because confusion is more intolerable than even pain. And the most accessible explanation, the one she's rehearsed since childhood, is, it must be me. Alice Miller, in her work on childhood trauma, reminds us that children learn to survive emotional neglect by internalizing the idea that they are the problem. Why? Because blaming the parent, or in adulthood the partner, would create a sense of helplessness. If the caregiver is incapable, the child is truly alone. So instead, she takes on the guilt. This becomes a psychological survival strategy. If I'm the problem, then I can become the solution. But as Freud might say, guilt is not always a sign of wrongdoing. It is often a sign of internal conflict, the ego struggling to reconcile what it feels with what it has been taught to believe. Freud saw guilt as the voice of the superego, the internalized voice of authority, morality, and social expectations. But what if your superego was shaped by distorted rules, by patriarchal expectations, by family systems that rewarded silence and punished emotional truth? Then guilt becomes not a compass, but a weapon. And here's the trap. Women who are emotionally intelligent, empathetic, and introspective are more likely to fall into over-responsibility because they want to understand, they want to grow. But when that reflection lacks boundaries, it turns inward and festers into shame. So how does a high-value woman handle this differently? She reclaims her side of the street without mopping up someone else's mess. She does not take responsibility for someone else's emotional immaturity. She does not label her needs as too much just because they were inconvenient to a partner. She does not confuse someone's avoidance with her unworthiness. She begins the subtle but profound shift from "what did I do wrong" to "what did I tolerate that wasn't right?" Let me give you a simple but powerful exercise, the circle of accountability. Take a blank sheet of paper, draw a circle. Inside that circle, write down everything that was truly your responsibility in the relationship. Your reactions, your silence, your boundaries not upheld. Be honest, but be fair. Do not write down being too sensitive or wanting more time. Those are not crimes. Those are human needs. Outside the circle, list everything that was not your responsibility. His avoidance, his dishonesty, his inability to communicate, his passive aggression. Look at that page and repeat to yourself, "I am only responsible for what is within my circle. The rest does not belong to me." This exercise interrupts the compulsive loop of guilt. It retrains your mind to separate your integrity from someone else's dysfunction. And slowly, your body learns a new truth. I am not to blame for the way someone else chose to mistreat me. Let me say something Freud himself might offer here, filtered through a modern lens. The ego that takes on all the guilt has not learned to distinguish between survival and truth. To heal, one must allow the unconscious demand for punishment to be replaced with conscious acts of compassion. So let me offer you a phrase, one that has the power to change your emotional architecture. I forgive myself for not knowing then what I know now. Not a blind, sugary forgiveness, but a sober, fierce kind. The kind that allows you to grieve without self-destruction, to learn without shame, to grow without guilt. Because the woman you are becoming, the woman who rises from heartbreak, not bitter but brighter, she knows the difference between accountability and self-blame. She examines her patterns not to punish herself, but to protect herself. She learns to say, yes, I ignored the red flags. Yes, I stayed longer than I should have. Yes, I kept trying to explain myself to someone who didn't want to understand. But she does not say, it was all my fault, because it wasn't. It never is. Love, when it's real, is never the reward for shrinking. So I'll ask you this. What part of your healing is still tied to the belief that you caused your own pain? And what would shift if you stopped blaming the wounded woman and started protecting her instead? That's the third pattern a high-value woman never repeats after heartbreak. 4. She doesn't suppress her emotions. What do you do with the ache you can't explain? The kind that moves through your chest like a storm that has no end? What happens to the tears that never get cried, the rage that gets swallowed, the heartbreak that gets rationalized into silence? Most women are taught early on how to carry emotional pain quietly, to be composed, to be pleasant, to not be dramatic. So after heartbreak, instead of screaming, sobbing, shaking, or falling apart, which are all natural responses to loss, they tighten their jaws, push the pain down, and pretend they're fine. But here's the truth that many only discover too late. What you suppress does not disappear. It reorganizes, it hides in the body. It becomes anxiety, chronic fatigue, digestive issues, insomnia, overeating, undereating, addictions that masquerade as coping mechanisms. Freud saw it clearly over a century ago. He named it repression, the defense mechanism of pushing unacceptable or painful emotions into the unconscious mind. But he also warned, unexpressed emotions will never die. They are buried alive and will come forth later in uglier ways. So let me ask you, where is your grief living right now? In your back pain, in your clenched jaw, in the way you keep reaching for distractions that leave you more exhausted than before? A high-value woman, one who is committed not just to survival but to emotional truth. She refuses to suppress what her heart needs to feel. She understands that healing requires emotional digestion, that grief is not a weakness to hide, but a process to honor. And that real strength is not found in stoicism, but in honest embodiment. When you suppress emotion, you are not protecting yourself. You are delaying your return to wholeness. Suppression happens when we believe our feelings are too big, too messy, too inconvenient to be held, either by others or by ourselves. Often this belief doesn't start with romance. It starts in childhood. If you were raised in an environment where emotional expression was unsafe, where crying led to ridicule, where anger was punished, where sadness was ignored, then it's likely you internalize the idea that strong emotions make you unlovable. So, as an adult, when heartbreak hits, your survival response kicks in. Bury it, hide it, smile anyway. But feelings that are not felt will find another way to speak. They might show up in how quickly you snap at others, how emotionally numb you feel in conversations, how you can't listen to certain songs without your chest tightening. This is not weakness. This is your nervous system asking to be seen, and until you do, it will not rest. Freud would tell us that repressed emotion is often displaced, projected onto irrelevant things, or stored somatically where it transforms into symptoms. A woman who cannot cry may become a woman who cannot sleep. A woman who cannot rage may become a woman who cannot trust. The work then is not just emotional, it is physiological, it is spiritual, it is symbolic. And it begins with permission. Permission to feel without filtering. Permission to express without explanation. Permission to grieve in the exact way your body wants, not the way others expect. So how do you do that in a world that rewards suppression and calls it maturity? Start small. Start sacred. Create a ritual of emotional release. Pick a time and place where you will not be interrupted. Light a candle. Put on music that brings the pain forward. Write what you're afraid to say out loud, to him, to yourself, to the past, then say it. Cry, shake, scream into a pillow, beat your fists against your bed. Let your body speak the grief your mind has been trying to suppress. It may feel awkward at first. It may feel theatrical. That's only because you've been conditioned to believe your pain must be polite. But let me be clear. A woman who gives her grief a voice does not become broken. She becomes whole. And this is not indulgence. This is emotional hygiene. Just as you would not eat rotten food and keep it in your system, you cannot ingest betrayal, abandonment, or heartbreak and expect your body to remain unaffected. A high-value woman does not bypass her pain. She metabolizes it. She lets her emotions rise like waves, knowing that every wave that peaks will also pass, if you let it. Here's another practice. The 30-minute feel session. Set a timer, no distractions, no phone, just you, a pen, paper, and your willingness to be real. Answer these prompts without censoring. What am I grieving that I haven't allowed myself to name? What emotions scare me the most, and why? What would happen if I stopped pretending I was fine? Then move, dance, cry, stretch. Let the emotion exit your body in whatever way it wants to. This is not just therapy. This is liberation. Because when you stop suppressing your emotions, you start communicating with your truth. And when you live in truth, you no longer need to contort yourself to be palatable to others. You stop saying, "I'm okay," when you're not. You stop trying to be the cool ex. You stop hiding your tears in the dark and learn to trust them as part of your healing. And here's what Freud might whisper if he stood beside you now. It is not the feeling that destroys you. It is the refusal to feel that becomes destruction. So I'll ask you this. What emotions have you buried so deeply you've forgotten they were even yours? And what might happen, not if you fixed them, but if you simply felt them? The woman you are becoming is not afraid of her emotional depth. She does not see it as excess. She sees it as evidence that she is alive, awake, and fully present to the human experience. Her tears are not weakness. They are wisdom. They say, "I no longer carry pain by silencing it. I heal it by honoring it." That's the fourth thing she never repeats after heartbreak. 5. She refrains from jumping into a new relationship immediately. There's a particular silence that follows heartbreak. Not the absence of noise, but the absence of familiar distraction. No texts, no plans, no daily rituals tethered to someone else's presence. And for many women, that silence is intolerable. So what happens? They rush to fill it. They swipe, flirt, respond to messages they don't truly care about. They say yes to coffee dates that don't excite them. They tell themselves, maybe this will help me move on. But beneath that impulse isn't hope, it's avoidance. Let's be honest, how often do we mistake movement for healing? Jumping into a new relationship, especially quickly, can feel like medicine. It flatters the ego. It softens the loneliness. It momentarily masks the ache of abandonment. But what it also does is prevent you from completing the emotional cycle of grief, because real healing requires a pause, a conscious, painful pause in which you are forced to meet yourself without performance, without distraction, without the identity of someone's partner to shield you. A high-value woman doesn't rush to be rechosen. She chooses herself, deliberately, reverently, consistently. She understands that the space between heartbreak and new love is not a void. It's a threshold. And crossing it too quickly means carrying the same wounds into new rooms, dressed up as new chemistry. Freud, if he were our witness here, would caution us against transference, the psychological phenomenon where unresolved feelings from past relationships are unconsciously redirected onto new people. What feels like attraction is often a reenactment. What feels like finally being seen is often another opportunity for your unconscious to repeat an old script. He might say, the psyche will always try to finish a story that was left incomplete, but if you do not pause, you will cast the same characters in different costumes. So let's ask the hard question. Are you looking for connection, or are you trying to avoid your own company? This is not judgment. This is clarity. And clarity is the most compassionate mirror, because underneath the impulse to move on quickly is often a deeper belief. If I'm not loved by someone, I'm not enough. And that belief is what a high-value woman dares to dismantle. She does it not by isolating, but by returning to the parts of herself that were silenced in the relationship, the dreams deferred, the friendships neglected, the sensuality dulled by emotional stress, the hobbies she once loved but no longer made time for. She uses this pause as a sacred reorientation, not as a punishment, not as exile, but as homecoming. Let's be clear. Abstaining from a relationship isn't about celibacy or romantic austerity. It's about conscious reconstruction. You don't build a cathedral over shattered ground. You clear the debris. You honor the destruction. You study the faults in the foundation. Only then can you build something worthy of your becoming. Let me offer a symbolic practice, one that honors this space of in-between. Create a relationship autopsy journal. Title one page, Who I Became in That Relationship. Write down the parts of yourself you abandoned, the boundaries you loosened, the dreams you shelved, the truths you softened to keep the peace. Title the next page, Who I Want to Be Before I Love Again. Write down the qualities you want to embody, not just in partnership, but in solitude. Write about how you want to walk through the world, how you want to be with yourself, how you want to love you so deeply that no one else gets to define your worth again. This journal is not an act of nostalgia, it's an act of reclamation. You see, emotional independence isn't found in not needing anyone, it's found in no longer needing a relationship to regulate your self-worth. That's what solitude gives you, not isolation but recentering. Freud once spoke about the reality principle, the psychological process of postponing immediate pleasure for long-term fulfillment. This is what waiting does. It teaches your psyche to tolerate discomfort without grasping for escape. And that is where real self-respect is born. When you resist the urge to be chosen quickly, you learn to choose yourself profoundly. And something miraculous happens. You stop performing. You stop auditioning. You stop bending into shapes just to be liked. And because of that, you become magnetic, not for attention, but for resonance. You begin to attract people who are drawn to your fullness, not your fear. Let me share a story, just one as we promised. There was a woman who had left a long, manipulative relationship. She had spent years being gaslit, invalidated, and made to feel too emotional. When it ended, everyone told her to get back out there, to show him what he lost. She almost did. She almost downloaded the app, responded to the flirt, booked the date. But instead, She booked a cabin. Alone. No phone. No distractions. Just her journal and a mirror she hadn't looked into in a long time. In those days of solitude, she met herself again, not as the broken ex, but as the sovereign woman beneath the pain. When she eventually did fall in love again, years later, it wasn't because she was afraid to be alone. It was because she wasn't. And that made all the difference. That woman isn't rare. She's simply a woman who waited until her silence turned into power. So I'll ask you, what might you find in the space between heartbreak and new love if you stopped rushing and started listening? Because the woman you're becoming knows this. I am not lonely in my solitude. I am complete in my becoming. And when she loves again, if she chooses to, it will not be from hunger. It will be from wholeness. That's the fifth pattern she never repeats after heartbreak. 6. She doesn't isolate herself from support systems. After heartbreak, there's a pull, quiet but powerful, to retreat from the world, to decline invitations, to ignore texts, to convince yourself that no one would understand anyway. This withdrawal can feel like self-protection, and sometimes it is at first. But prolonged emotional isolation is not the same as solitude. Solitude is chosen, it's spacious, it's nourishing. Isolation is a contraction, a fear-based pulling away that says, I'll handle this alone because I don't trust anyone to hold it with me. Here's the paradox. So many women pride themselves on being strong, independent, emotionally self-sufficient, yet underneath that pride is often a wound that whispers, if I reach out, I'll be judged. If I lean on someone, I'll be a burden. But let's be honest. Where did you learn that your pain was something to hide? Many of us grew up in environments where vulnerability was met with dismissal. Crying was weakness. Asking for help was shameful. Expressing loneliness meant you were needy, dramatic, or worst of all, too sensitive. So when heartbreak comes, it reactivates that old belief. If I let people see me like this, they'll leave too. Freud might tell us that isolation, in this case, functions as a defense, a retreat into the ego's illusion of control. But emotional pain is not meant to be carried alone. We are social beings, biologically wired for connection. And one of the most healing forces in the aftermath of emotional rupture is simply being witnessed without being fixed. A high-value woman understands this. She does not confuse isolation with healing. She does not suffer in silence to prove her strength. She reaches for her people, wisely, carefully, but deliberately. She knows that healing is not a performance, it's a shared space. Sometimes all it takes is a single conversation, a friend who listens without judgment, a therapist who reflects your truth back to you, to remind your nervous system, you're not alone. So here's your invitation. Make one connection this week that is rooted in honesty. A coffee with a friend where you don't pretend to be okay. A call to someone who makes you feel safe. A therapy session where you let the tears fall without apology. Because the woman you are becoming is no longer afraid to be seen in her grief. She knows that vulnerability is not dependence. It is courage. And courage shared becomes healing multiplied. 7. She avoids negative self-talk and limiting beliefs. There's a voice, subtle, persistent, that often arises in the quiet after heartbreak. It whispers things like, you're too old to start over. You should have known better. This always happens to you, and maybe it's you. This is not truth. This is internalized conditioning. Many women, especially those shaped by years of emotional dismissal or relational disappointment, have absorbed beliefs that erode their sense of worth. Not all at once, but slowly, like water dripping on stone. With each failed relationship, each unmet need, each betrayal that went unacknowledged, the belief settles deeper. Maybe I'm the common denominator. Freud might suggest that this negative self-talk is the voice of the superego, turned cruel, a distorted inner critic that doesn't reflect your essence, but rather the accumulated voices of criticism you were once too young to challenge. But the high-value woman, the emotionally sovereign woman, refuses to let that voice dictate her identity. She begins the radical work of challenging every thought that begins with, I'm not enough. She asks, whose voice is this really? A parent, a former partner, a culture that punishes women for being too independent, too outspoken, too feeling. She doesn't silence the inner critic by force. She disarms it through awareness. And more importantly, she speaks back. Instead of repeating old scripts, "I'll always be alone. Men don't value women like me." She rewrites them. "I am not too much. I am deeply attuned. My age is not a limitation. It is evidence of wisdom. What I ask for is not excessive. It is human." This reprogramming is not about toxic positivity. It's about creating mental boundaries, about refusing to be an emotional bully to yourself when the world has already tried to shrink you. So here's your practice. Each time you hear a limiting belief rise in your mind, pause, write it down. Then write the truthful reframe, the one that reflects your values, not your fears. Because the woman you're becoming doesn't just protect her heart, she protects her mind. She doesn't tolerate internal abuse in the name of humility. She stands in her dignity, not just outwardly but inwardly. And when she speaks to herself, she uses the tone she once wished others would. That's the seventh, and perhaps most sacred and thing she never repeats after heartbreak. Pain will visit, that's inevitable. But whether it stays, whether it defines your worth, whether it rewrites your identity, that's a choice. You've now seen 7 patterns a high-value woman refuses to repeat after heartbreak. Not because she's fearless, but because she's self-honest. She no longer clings to fantasies. She stops chasing what left. She refuses to blame herself for someone else's failures. She feels deeply but doesn't drown. She waits to love again with intention. She leans on support, not pride. And most of all, she no longer lets her inner voice tear her down. She doesn't settle for survival. She rises into sovereignty. So now I ask you, honestly, which one of these patterns are you still holding on to? And what would it feel like to finally let it go? Share your reflections in the comments. Be brave. Say what's true. And if this spoke to something deep in you, subscribe for more. You're not alone in this work, and you never have to be.